I'm not going to do any introductions because Craig Hazen is going to actually act as a moderator in what's a sort of a discussion type of seminar this afternoon. So do please welcome Craig, Jeff, and William.
Bravo. Thank you, Justin. Welcome back from lunch. We hope you're not experiencing what we call in the States food coma, which is where you're just going to flop over after lunch due to blood sugar issues. I think we'll keep it stimulating for you. Just delighted you're here. In fact, let me share something with you. This might actually cause you to lapse into food coma if I'm not careful, but it's a quote from Dostoevsky. The very fact that you're here means a great deal, and I quote this passage often after I read it. It's about Alyosha Karamazov. And here's what it says about him. It must be added that in a way he, that's Alyosha, was indeed a member of our younger generation, which means that he was honest, that he believed in, demanded and searched for truth, that because he believed in it, he yearned to serve it and give it his whole strength. He was spoiling for immediate action, was prepared to sacrifice everything, even his own life, in an act of supreme devotion. Unfortunately, these young men often fail to understand that the sacrifice of their lives may be the easiest of all sacrifices. Much easier, for instance, than giving up 5 or 6 years of their seething youth to hard study, to the acquisition of knowledge, which would increase their strength tenfold in the service of that great cause and in the performance of the great works to which they aspire. But to sacrifice those few years to study often proves too much for them. Well, it hasn't proved too much for you. You carved out a beautiful Saturday to come here and sit in a somewhat darkened room and listen to some scholars who've worked very hard so that you might raise your game. Christianity is a knowledge tradition, and I'm just so grateful for the Unbelievable Gang and Premier for putting on this conference. And we've been delighted to partner with them and with Reasons to Believe and even with Reasonable Faith. So thank you all for coming. And let me introduce the very special guests here. We've got William Lane Craig, who's a research professor of philosophy at the Talbot School of Theology at Biola University in Southern California. He holds a doctorate from Munich and a doctorate from Birmingham in New Testament and in philosophy, respectively. And he started an organization a number of years ago called Reasonable Faith. And you have something about that in your delegate packets. Take a look at that and log on to Reasonable Faith and find out what they're up to, because it's a first-rate organization taking on all comers who are skeptics and agnostics and unbelievers in a very gentle and respectful way. So check that out. And we've got Jeff Zweerink here, who is a researcher at Reasons to Believe, another organization in Southern California. He holds a PhD in astronomy, or is it astrophysics?
Maybe astrophysics.
Astrophysics. From Iowa State University. He teaches occasionally at the University of California, Los Angeles, and spends his time wandering the globe, speaking on scientific issues and making a nuisance of himself for Jesus in all the right places. Gentlemen, do you have any opening comments?
I just got to say that I've noticed that there's a difference in how philosophers and scientists look at things, because I got the philosopher's take on business casual is very different than the scientist's take on business casual. So.
Well, one remark that I might make, piggybacking on what Jeff said, is Sean Carroll, who is an atheistic cosmologist that I've debated, made what I thought was a very perceptive remark about philosophers and scientists. He said, scientists cannot understand why philosophers are so concerned about hair splitting over words when what matters is reality. Whereas philosophers wonder, how can scientists continue to talk about things when they don't even know what they're talking about? And that really does capture, I think, the ethos of these two communities. Philosophers are very concerned about precision of concepts, definitions, whereas scientists sometimes can be impatient of that and want to get on with the empirical work. So that is a helpful conversation for us to be engaged in because we both bring different strengths to the table, I think.
You know, it is very much, I've noticed as a scientist, I get to work with Ken Samples, who's a philosopher theologian, and so we have these dialogues a fair bit. And what I've noticed is that as a scientist, I'm kind of thinking, how does this work? What can I say about it? And you know, it's very often it's, you know, okay, what does this data mean? You know, there's a driven by what is reality? Does this explain what is reality? And there's a whole lot of philosophy behind that I just kind of assume works. And, you know, he's kind of pressed me on it, and, you know, we've had these discussions and kind of, you know, why can you trust what your brain's saying? And my thought was, well, because it works. You know, I just go out and test it. And it really does illustrate that divide there, because the philosopher is concerned with why does it work? In some sense, the scientist just knows it works and goes out and says, what can I do with this? How do I understand the world? And I find that as a Christian, making a defense of the Christian faith, that while science has a lot to say, philosophy has a tremendous lot to say in too. It's a kind of a two-pronged, I don't know, attack is not the right word, but it's a two-pronged approach to making a rational defense of the Christian faith.
I want to affirm what Jeff is saying there. The dialogue between science and theology is really flourishing in our day. There is tremendous academic interest in the dialogue between science and theology. And I find that philosophy serves as the bridge between these two disciplines, so that it really is a three-person dialogue. It's the scientist, the theologian, and the philosopher in conversation. And this sort of interdisciplinary conversation, I think, is tremendously illuminating.
Right.
Let me go back to square one for a popular audience, and that would be, you know, how does this all relate to the Bible? How does it all relate to my faith? Sometimes people ask me, what do you think, Craig, is the most important or the biggest apologetic problem to be solved in the world today? Well, if I think on a popular level, the problem is simply this. Most of the people you're going to be talking to with regard to the Christian faith think almost immediately that what you have engaged in as a Christian is some sort of blind leaping. You closed your eyes, you went to the edge of the religious abyss, and you leapt off, and there it is. And you know what happens. Oh, this happens in the States all the time where, you know, let's say there's a person in an office building, they've got a Bible on their desk, you know, and the local skeptic or agnostic walks by and has a look at that and says, oh, you're a religious person, a Christian. Good for you, good for you. And you know what they mean by that. They mean, good for you, you're the kind of person who needs that. I, on the other hand, they're thinking, am more of a rational, scientific type who wants facts and evidence. But you know what? This is what gets you through the day. Good for you. Oh,
Yeah.
help us with this, gentlemen. This is a popular notion that we just need help with. And I know you can address these things at the very highest levels. But I'm wondering for a moment if you can help those of us who are wandering around in the streets.
I think, you know, it is remarkable how often I hear that. You know, it's kind of the, you know, okay, scientists, we have the reason and the facts, and you guys have your faith and your belief, and that's good. And at some point, not too many years ago, I was kind of challenged to think about that. I mean, you know, there's instances out of my life where you can look and you look and say, what did Jeff Zweerink do? And it's like, oh, that's a blind faith. And as I began thinking about it, it occurred to me, I don't think I've exercised blind faith ever in there, because the reason why I'm a Christian is because from the youngest time I can remember, my parents were Christians and they taught me Christian principles. And so I would trust, I mean, why wouldn't I trust my parents? That's a natural place to trust that they're giving me good information. And then at some point in time, that faith, or that my trust in Christianity wasn't resting in them. It's that I began to look and say, what does the Bible say? And does it correspond with science? And does it give a good historical account where it talks about it? There's all this evidence that I put into. It's like, okay, yes, I have good reason to believe that what the Bible says is true because of what the evidence says. And so I acknowledge that that's the way it's often portrayed, is there's the science and the facts, and then there's the faith. But the reality of it is, we all put our faith in something. The thing that's worthwhile to put your faith in is what's true and where all the evidence points. And so a Christian faith, a vibrant Christian faith, really is something founded on what the evidence points to, not in spite of what the evidence says.
I'd like to excavate the assumption, Craig, that I think lies behind the attitude that you expressed. This morning in my talk, I talked about verificationism, which was this philosophy of meaning popular back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, which said that if something can't be empirically verified, then it's meaningless. What that meant is that anything that couldn't be a matter of empirical science was simply a matter of feeling or sentiment. And that applied specifically to ethics and religious beliefs. So that when you say it is morally wrong to steal, what you just mean is, well, I feel that it's wrong to steal. That's bad for me. That offends me. Or if you say, I believe that God created the world, that is just your personal feeling. It has no factual significance. And I think that this attitude that you express, which sounds so tolerant, doesn't it? Oh, if that's good for you, that's fine. You can believe that if you want. That's good. I'm glad. That's an expression or a lingering vestige of this old verificationism, which says that matters of religion and ethics are just expressions of personal sentiment and emotion, not matters of fact. And therefore there is no truth about these things, and therefore you can believe what you want about those sorts of things. So what really sticks behind this, and I think what we as Christians need to challenge, is that when we make assertions about God or other religious or theological issues, that we are not making statements of taste. We are asserting statements of fact. And we mean for them to be understood as factual statements, not expressions of sentiment. And once you understand that, that puts a whole different complexion on the issue, because now they have to be assessed in terms of their truth and falsity, which mere expressions of sentiment cannot be. So again, I think we see in popular culture this lingering shadow of verificationism from the first half of the 20th century that is still so much with us.
Right. If you went to my resurrection seminar this morning, you know that I did my doctoral work in religious studies, a very secular program at the University of California in Santa Barbara, a top-ranked program. I studied under Ninian Smart. Some of you may know him, a famous British religious studies scholar. But one thing, I got a chance to study all of the great world religious traditions, and it really stunned me how Christianity was different. And it was different in a number of respects, and I explore those in my book called 5 Sacred Crossings, but there's the one I want to point to now, and that's Christianity is a standout in that it's what I would call testable. I know you use that kind of language at Reasons to Believe. There's probably better philosophical terms to use, but I like to use it in a popular vein, that Christianity is testable. And what I mean by testable is you can offer evidence for it, you can offer evidence against it, and the evidence actually means something. In other words, you can make decisions about Christianity based on that kind of investigation. And I find that makes Christianity, it puts it in the unique place. And I'm just curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say I've gone off and studied a lot of other world religions, but I do find that element of testability that really is when the Gospels and when the New Testament talks about what it means to be a Christian and what it means to believe. It's in that context of believing what is true. And you can put evidence that is true or evidence that is false. One of my favorite passages out of the Gospels is Matthew 11, where John the Baptist comes and asks Jesus, are you the one or should we wait for another? I mean, if you think about who John the Baptist is, that is the most ludicrous question in the world. I mean, he's the one who saw baptize Jesus, pull him out of the water, heaven opens up, this is my beloved son. Anybody should have known who Jesus was. It was him. But the question is not so interesting, but Jesus' response was interesting. It wasn't, come on, John, you just got to have faith, or John, that's a dumb question. He gave him a list of evidence that says, am I who I say I am or not? It was testable, and he gave him the evidence that shows, yes, he passed the test.
My textual backing for the idea that Christianity is testable and is set apart is I call this passage in 1 Corinthians the strangest passage in all of religious literature. It's 1 Corinthians 15 verses 12 through 19, where the Apostle Paul says several times to make sure we get it. If Jesus did not come back from the dead, your faith is worthless. If Jesus did not come back from the dead, your faith is empty. My goodness. In other words, if that basic historical event did not take place, we're kind of fooling ourselves hanging out in this lovely palace on a Saturday afternoon. We probably ought to go be doing something else. And that is strange business. You just don't find religions that open themselves up to that kind of investigation. Well, let's dig a little deeper. Let me read you something and see what you think about this. This came from an opinion piece in the Los Angeles Times a number of years ago. It's an engineering professor from the University of Southern California. His name is Bart Costco. And back when the United States was, they were talking about funding faith programs through the government. And this guy got in a huff, and he wanted to give us a little bit of a lecture on faith. And he says, look, you got to understand something. Faith, and here's his definition, is unwarranted belief. Faith is belief without evidence or despite evidence to the contrary. Faith occurs when a person believes that something is true even though he suspects it's false. It takes large doses of such faith to support the very existence of casinos, psychic hotlines, astrology columns, mall Santas, and most organized religions. Do you see a problem with the way we use the word faith in the church?
Well, frankly, no, Craig. I think I see a problem in the way the atheist community uses the word faith. That is the definition in my interaction with unbelievers that many of them have, is they think that faith is believing something that you really know isn't true, and that somehow you believe it anyway. And this is simply not the way believers use the word faith. I think the best definition I heard of faith is trusting in what you have good reason to think is true. That's what I would define faith as. Faith is trusting in that which you have good reason to think is true. And there's no conflict in that case between reason and faith. You have good reason to think it's true, and therefore you put your confidence and trust in it. And anyone can define words how he wants. So if that's what the unbeliever wants to talk about faith, then I'll say, well, then what I'm talking about is schmaith. And I have schmaith in God, which is trusting in what I have good reason to believe in true, and I don't have what you mean by faith. And you just get into a word game in that case. The point is we're not using words with the same meaning. We're not talking the same vocabulary. And so in his sense of faith, I reject that.
But I do think in the Christian church, we often say faith, and I think we kind of imply that sort of definition. As I read through Scripture, I find your definition of faith, that's what it's talking about there. But I do hear a lot of Christians kind of talking about, you just got to have faith, almost as though it's like, even though the evidence doesn't indicate it, you just kind of need to believe. And so I can see why the non-Christian would look at the way Christians use the term kind of casually as meaning that. And I think we need to be very careful about that, because I think what your definition is what the Bible talks about in terms of what faith is.
Yeah, one worries that maybe somebody like Bart Costco, is basically parroting a secular view of faith, that really it's all about blind leaping. And then, unfortunately, because we don't have good theologians and Bible exegetes in the church giving us a proper understanding, we're actually picking it back up from people like Bart Costco about what it all means. Don't know for sure, but it's problematic. I think what you're doing is giving us a definition of faith that's really going to help us do clear Christian thinking and apologetics. for goodness sakes, if it is blind leaping, well, then perhaps when the Mormons do come to your door, you can, give them a bigger cookie, and we'll be moving on. Let's go a little deeper. You mentioned some things right at the outset that I want to go back to. Do you see a difference in the so-called battle for science, this big warfare that's going on out there, between what we see in popular culture and at the academic research level?
I certainly do, Craig. On the academic level, as I said, there's tremendous openness and dialogue between scientists and theologians today. The John Templeton Foundation is pouring millions and millions of dollars into funding this kind of interdisciplinary dialogue, conferences, publication projects. As you may know, John Templeton was the great financier. He has set up large foundations in the United States, in Britain, and elsewhere to help fund this kind of interdisciplinary work. And both Oxford University and Cambridge University have established chairs in science and theology. So there is a flourishing dialogue that's going on today in conferences and peer-reviewed journals and academic publications. But you would never know that from reading the works, the popular level works of a Richard Dawkins or a Lawrence Krauss, people of this sort, where they perpetuate the myth that somehow theology and science are at each other's throats. And this kind of popular level warfare is just not reflective of what's going on in the academy. It's pop culture, and it is not an accurate representation of what real experts in these disciplines are doing today.
No, I would very much concur with that, and I had the opportunity to take a few history of science classes when I was in college and graduate school, and one of the professors that I had there, I ended up getting one of the books that he was an editor of and reading, and it talks about this conflict thesis that science and religion, and specifically Christianity, are in conflict with one another, and they say, from the way the historians talk about it, this conflict thesis is still prevalent and prominent. But from a history of science, the best scholarship in the history of science, it's a non-tenable hypothesis that there have been occasional times of conflict, but often it's been one of mutual benefit or just kind of side-by-side operating independent, that there's a far more complex relationship with these occasional hostilities. And so this idea that they're at war with one another is academically a non-tenable hypothesis, and so I find that very interesting, but nonetheless exactly what I would expect if God's the author of creation and the inspiration for Scripture. So
yeah, I want to second one point that Jeff made, and that is the complexity of the way science and theology interact. This isn't a simple one-one relationship. There are all sorts of ways in which science and theology can interact with each other. For example, theology historically has furnished a conceptual framework in which science can flourish. And many historians would say that's why modern science was birthed in the West rather than in the Orient or in Africa. It was because of the conceptual framework that Christian theology gave to the West that enabled science to flourish. I think that science can either verify or falsify certain claims of religion. I would say that theology can also provide explanatory resources that would be helpful in explaining the world in ways that science isn't equipped to answer. So there is quite a variety of complex ways in which science and theology interrelate, and we shouldn't be overly simplistic about this.
A couple more things. Maybe we can take a question or two from the audience. Maybe we can set up a mic. I'm not sure if there's one available, or you can just shout. Let us know from the back in just a moment how we want to handle that. There's a 50 cents or a 50 pence word used in the title of this, the rise of scientism. Bill, what is scientism?
Scientism is the view that the physical sciences alone are our only source of knowledge. and that therefore the physical sciences are the final arbiter of truth. And someone who really takes seriously this kind of scientism rejects not merely theology or ethics, but every other discipline, ultimately at the university, if it can't be reduced to physics. So for example, the humanities go out the window. Alex Rosenberg, whom I mentioned in my opening talk today, is such a scientistic epistemologist, or epistemological naturalist, as this is also called. And he basically says that the humanities are a source of entertainment for us, but they give us no knowledge. That it is only through physics that we have knowledge of the truth. And this is just so patently wrong. People who have no theological axe to grind at all, philosophers and people in other disciplines, recognize that this is an overly restrictive view of what knowledge is and how we gain truth. Timothy Williamson is a philosopher at Oxford University. As far as I know, he's not a believer at all. But he gave the following example in response to Rosenberg. He said, no one could prove scientifically, but we know from literary criticism that Mr. Collins is not the hero of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Now, anyone who's read Pride and Prejudice will know Mr. Collins isn't the hero, but that's not a truth that is discoverable through physics. But literary criticism tells us that. That simple example, I think, just explodes this scientism as being an overly restrictive theory of knowledge.
And how does it relate to naturalism? What is naturalism and how does it relate?
Right. Naturalism is, again, a complex phenomenon. There is an epistemological naturalism, which would be this scientism, which would say the physical sciences alone are the only source of knowledge and truth. That would be epistemological naturalism. Metaphysical naturalism, however, would be the view that only the physical world exists. So there are no gods, there are no minds, there are no angels or supernatural entities, only the entities that appear in our theories of physics are real. That would be metaphysical naturalism. The other is an epistemological naturalism. It's a theory of knowledge. Metaphysical naturalism, is a theory of what is real.
So you could be an atheist without being an epistemological naturalist.
Exactly. That's exactly right, Jeff. And I would say the majority of philosophers who are atheists today would not be scientistic or naturalist in that sense. So that's quite right. But ironically as well, I think you could be an epistemological naturalist and still be a theist if you think that we have good scientific evidence for God. W.V.O. Quine was the late American philosopher in the 20th century, very prominent. He was an epistemological naturalist. But Quine said explicitly, he said, if someone could show me scientific evidence for God, spirits, other sorts of things, he said, I would quite happily accord them scientific status, along with quarks, black holes, and other theoretical entities of science that you can't see, taste, touch, or hear, but they do explanatory work in our theories of physics. So in that sense, ironically, Quine was really open to the existence of God if you could give scientific evidence for God. Now, I'm not an epistemological naturalist. I think we have sources of knowledge other than physics, such as divine revelation and rational intuition, moral experience. But still, I think you're correct in saying that even epistemological naturalism and metaphysical naturalism don't mutually imply each other. These are independent theses, not mutually entailing.
Well, that's, you're going back to your comment earlier about the discussion that this is really a discussion between theologians, scientists, and philosophers, is that, in some sense for the epistemological naturalist, that discussion's pointless because the scientist really has the only thing worth saying at some level. But as an apologist, it also makes things a little bit difficult because you do have to understand the philosophy of the arguments. I work at an organization, Reasons to Believe, and we look at scientific evidences for God. at the end of the day, a lot of those evidences fall into things that support the teleological and the cosmological arguments, which are philosophical discussions. And then you have this discussion of what does the Bible have to say? Well, that's a theological discussion. And so to do that well, you have to be able to play in the theology realm, or at least know people who do theology well. You have to be in the philosophical realm or know people who do philosophy well. And then you have to know what the science has to say as well. And so it's not just this simple endeavor, but it's a very engaging, fun endeavor to be a part of.
I love it, and I think what Jeff has emphasized here is that since no one person can be a specialist in all of these areas, this is a collaborative project where we'll work together on these things, and each one bringing our own area of expertise.
Right.
Well, let me give you an example of that. Now, this is going to really impress you being a real science guy, Jeff, but you're sitting next to one of the world's experts on the effects of arginine vasotocin on water transfer through the pelvic patch of the western toad. No, I'm not kidding. I am one of the world's experts on that topic. Ran a whole research lab, on that for a number of years as a biologist, and but I say that really to impress you. But secondly, to highlight this narrowness of scientific investigation. Now, so those are the kinds of things I studied in a lab, and some of the professors who are running the lab, they'd walk in and they studied the pelvic patch of the western toad too, and they would feel the ability to pontificate on just about any topic in the lab. They'd move from history to current events to philosophy. And honestly, I had actually studied a little bit of philosophy and theology, and I was usually snickering in the corner because they weren't getting it even close to right. Based on that scenario, help us understand the situation with folks like Hawking and Dawkins. What do you make of that? This seminar uses their names, so let's make sure we address what's going on in their minds and writings.
I've got to say, I haven't read a whole lot of Dawkins just because he's outside my physical or my scientific discipline, but I've read Stephen Hawking's latest book, The Grand Design with Mlodinow, and I read Lawrence Krauss's latest book, The Universe from Nothing. And the thing that I found interesting, being a scientist and being very much a part of that, my discipline is better than your discipline mentality, is that they both start off their book saying philosophy is pointless or philosophy is dead, and then they go through their book making a whole bunch of philosophical statements. That it's very easy to say, okay, by knowing my little knowledge, I've got the corner on things, not appreciating that this really is a very complex discussion. And I know enough philosophers, and I'm good friends with a few of them, that they just look at things very differently than I do. And by being able to interact with them, I get a far more complete picture of how things actually work. And so I think some of it is there's this snobbery almost that comes with being a hard scientist, physics, chemistry, that tends to, I understand the pontification that goes on, but I think we end up missing because there are people who study those other disciplines well and really do make great contributions. So.
Yeah. The first third of Hawking and Mlodinow's book is a discussion of scientific realism versus anti-realism, which is a deep philosophical question. And they say that, or approach this after saying that philosophy is dead and has nothing to say. It's just astonishing. How can they be so blind? Sir Martin Rees, who is the Astronomer Royal, has said publicly, so I'm not saying anything that he hasn't printed. He said, I've known Stephen Hawking for over 40 years. And he said, Stephen has no firsthand acquaintance with theology at all. And therefore, his statements about philosophy and theology really don't have any sort of expertise behind them at all. It's just that in our culture, scientists have become such authority figures, almost a priesthood, where they can pronounce on all areas, even outside their narrow areas of specialization. And so often, these pronouncements are philosophically naive and really outrageous and quite mistaken.
Well, let me make sure I ask the actual question of the session. Is atheism winning the battle for science? Do you have anything to say on that?
You know, I think there are some very prominent very prominent scientists who are atheists who get to be the spokespeople for a lot of what science has to say. And, you know, that's why I think this popular debate plays out as, you know, science and Christianity and they're opposed to one another. I think because we've allowed that to be the way the discussion has happened. But if you ask the question, do the discoveries we find in studying the universe, and I'll kind of restrict myself to physics and cosmology, do those discoveries point towards an atheistic worldview, or do those discoveries point towards a theistic Christian worldview? I would say that when you look at the major discoveries over the last 100 years, those almost uniformly say those fit far more comfortably in a Christian worldview than they do in an atheistic worldview. And so, you know, at least on that sort of measure, no, atheism is not winning the battle. That doesn't mean you can't be an atheist and be a good scientist, but when you look at what the data points to, it really does point to Christianity. I think strongly it points to Christianity.
I think that's very well said, Jeff. I think that contemporary physics is more open to a creator and designer of the universe than it has been in any recent memory. When you think of physics at the end of the 19th century, for example, it was thought to be a closed science almost.
Yeah.
And then came relativity theory, then came quantum theory, and just upended the classical view of physics. And that old worldview, which operated like a kind of machine independent of God and excluded God, is gone. And I think now scientists are very open to metaphysical realities, like a creator and designer of the universe, not to speak of a ground for moral values and ethics, for example, and then history as well, with the advance of New Testament studies and the historical Jesus. So if there is a battle for science that is being won by secularism, that would only be in pop culture. In popular culture, you have to say the Dawkins and the Krauses and others, they get a lot of popular press in the media. They really do seem to, in some ways, be winning the media war. But that isn't what's really happening in the academy. And I have great confidence that in time this is going to straighten itself out. One of the great things I appreciate about science is that it's self-correcting. When it goes off the track, when it veers off the track, eventually it comes back online because it has to deal with a recalcitrant reality out there that is the way it is, regardless of how we think of it. And so science has this wonderful self-correcting nature to it. And so I'm very optimistic about where the future direction lies.
I would kind of say in with that, one of the things that I find interesting is, you know, eventually it gets around there. That eventually may be much longer than I like it. You know, it may be tens of years to hundreds of years. But, you know, I think one of the strongest pieces of evidence in support of a Christian worldview from a scientific perspective is that our universe began to exist. And you look at the history of what's gone on over the last 100 years, and that idea was fought vigorously in the scientific community, and in part because the scientists look for so many ways to get around the beginning. It is one of the better established facts in science. You know, so it's that investigation, that testability, these ideas that are playing out there that ultimately have produced what I would argue one of the strongest apologetic arguments we have for the Christian faith. And so that interplay is, I found that remarkable that that's happened over the last 100 years. And that's one of the reasons why I don't think you can say atheism is winning.
Well, do you have any questions for our experts? You were fast on the draw. Yes, sir. Nice and loud so everybody can hear.
No, we got a microphone coming here.
We do have a microphone. I should have called on somebody in the back.
Right over there.
Thank you. I heard Dr. Craig mention about the importance of definition in philosophy, but I'm surprised that the definition of science itself hasn't been explained precisely. To me, etymologically, science just means knowledge, and that's number one. The second one is, I ask you precisely what you mean by science now. And secondly, to me, I am a scientist myself, and I don't see science or branches of it as similar one another. Only mathematics to me has a very viable property. The others aren't necessarily. You see, so for example, when Richard Dawkins talks about biology and macroevolution, the rebuttal of that claims of Richard Dawkins doesn't come necessarily from theists. It comes from other branches of science too, like Marcel Paul Schutzenberger, a mathematician of France, clearly have objections of it. David Berlinski also. Now, in terms of science, you have a mathematical equation that explains the behavior of fluid, for example.
Can you just hit him with a question?
I can. The question is definition, number one. Number two is, I think you ought to see science as not, the branches of science as not equal one another. One has to be very skeptical about what scientist means by science. Is it mathematics, or is it physics, or is it biology? These, to me, are not the same. Thirdly, you mentioned about science has this nature of being self-refuting in the end. Sadly, I don't really think so. There's deep political issues, especially those who grant funding, who clearly has something to say about what kind of science directed to where. You see what I mean? Take climate change, for example. This is very
Thank you.
politically.
Okay.
The question of the definition of science is a philosophical question. It's not one that you can answer scientifically. And it's been extraordinarily difficult to find the limits of science. And this is called the delimitation problem. The lines are blurry. If you define science so broadly as you were suggesting, which is basically it's knowledge, that is the Latin root for science, scientia. Scientia means knowledge. The problem then becomes everything becomes science then. And it ceases to be a useful term in that sense. My German theological students were often exercised by the question, is theology a science? And it was difficult for us Americans to understand what they were even asking, is theology a science? What they meant is theology scientia? Is it knowledge? And certainly, as Craig said, Christianity is a knowledge tradition. It is knowledge, it is scientia. In that wide sense, it's science. But that's so broad that it's not very useful. It's useful to think of science more in terms of the empirical investigation of the physical world. Maybe, Jeff, you'd have something more to say about that.
Yeah, that's one of the, it's a difficult question to answer because even within a scientific discipline, what falls as a scientific question changes over time as we learn to investigate. I mean, the idea of asking what was before the Big Bang 50, 60 years ago, or 30, 40 years ago, that wasn't a scientific question because we had no tools to investigate that. Now we're beginning to get some tools that allow us to probe that. I mean, granted, it's on the speculative end of the scientific spectrum, but so even within a specific discipline, it's hard to answer the question, is that a scientific question or not? So, I kind of hate to say this, but at some level, it's like part of the training as a scientist is to understand, you eventually learn to know, well, that's science and that's not, but it's very hard to define. I appreciate the demarcation of where that line is difficult to draw.
Another question. Where's our mic? There it is. I'll pick somebody in the back. All right. Yeah, go ahead. You pick somebody. You have a good eye.
Hi, I just want to pick up on something you said about the Big Bang. You were saying it's one of the more established facts of science. And if you take something like quasars, there was a big debate. If you'd gone to a conference years ago, there was a huge debate, are quasars extragalactic objects or not? If you go to a conference, I've been to conferences on the early universe, and you'll see big arguments. You see the people who work on Hijava, lift-shift gravity, loop quantum gravity string theory, people like Guth, Nomura, Penrose, they all argue that the universe may be eternal, whereas other people like Vilenkin, Mittani, Busso argue the opposite. It seems like this is actually what you were saying. The next thing you're saying was people looking before the Big Bang. It's a much more open question, it appears to me, than, let's say, the quasars. You don't get debates about whether quasars are extragalactic objects at conferences now, whereas the Big Bang is still very much debated. Would you agree that they're just quite different class of claims?
I guess I would, thank you, where I would, the comments I would make is that when you go back 20, 30 years ago, the question of whether quasars were galactic or close was something we didn't have the data to answer the question. And we now have built, the Sloan Digital Sky Survey and other instruments, and we've been able to answer pretty definitively, yes, that quasars are at cosmological distances, or they're far away, they're not something inside our galaxy. Well, in the similar sort of sense, obviously the Big Bang is a much broader, it encompasses a whole lot more discussion, but even 20, 30 years ago, what we knew of the Big Bang, or what we could test of Big Bang models, was much more limited because we didn't have nearly the amount of data that we would like to have. Now we have the measurement of the cosmic microwave background, the COBE measurement of the ripples, and then followed up by the WMAP, followed up by Planck, followed up by the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, and all of these different things that allow us to restrict what a Big Bang model looks like. What I do know is this, that it's not that you can't posit other models of the universe, but that model of the universe explains so much more of the data than any other one. And so I can't say the Big Bang is a fact in that it's indisputable and incontrovertible, but it is a fact in the sense that all of the data points to it being correct. It would be a remarkable thing to find any sort of scientific data at this point that would argue that the Big Bang didn't happen. Or that we don't live in a Big Bang universe. In the same way, we don't know for a fact that stars are made of hydrogen and burn and fuse hydrogen in their core, but all the data points that way. And so I would say it's a fact in that sense.
Thank you. We'll get back to the audience in a minute. Let's. Just was reminded of going to a wedding one time. So I go to a wedding of a friend of mine, and this friend he's kind of an engineer. He designs furniture for a living, but he watches a lot of science television. In the United States, we've got the Discovery Channel, and he watches PBS, public broadcasting shows on television, and he considers himself a bit of an armchair scientist, and he's always giving me a bad time. Hazen, you're a religion guy, and I'm a science guy. So over our friendship, over the years, he's always repeating this little mantra, and he's getting married. So he invites me and a few friends to his wedding, and we go, and I remember it was at the reception, and they were serving champagne, and he and his new bride had a few glasses, and they were wandering around greeting their guests. They finally walked out to the table where I was, sitting with some friends, and he walks up to the table and goes, "Hey, Hazen, thanks for coming to my wedding. I'm so glad you're here. We've had some great talks over the years. But I think it all boils down to this, You're a religion guy, and me, I'm a science guy." So I probably shouldn't have said this at his wedding. It just came out, I said, okay, so is it wrong to torture babies for fun? Strange question to ask at a guy's wedding, right? Well, he's thinking about it because he knows we've had enough conversations where I've got a trick embedded in this somewhere, and he's thinking about the trick. Well, he delayed. It didn't even take a nanosecond of delay before his new bride is looking at him with great worry. She's got a hold of his arm, and she's looking up at him and at me and him, and he said, well, tell the man it's wrong. Of course it's wrong. He knows it's wrong, right, dear? And he's still thinking about it. She's hitting him in the shoulder. It was a disaster, but he met with me months later and said, "You really had me in a pickle there, because I was thinking, look, if he's asking that, if I say, yes, it's wrong to torture babies for fun, I'm admitting that there's something I can know about the universe that didn't derive from science." He actually got the point. I think it took the bride punching him in the arm to get through. So yeah, if I say no, it's not wrong, I'm in trouble with my wife. If I say yes, I'm admitting something some bit of knowledge of the universe that did not derive from science. What are these lines of demarcation? Where does science stop and other forms of knowledge pick up?
Well, now I think as Jeff said, it's very hard to draw lines of demarcation that are not blurry. In cosmology, for example, as you know, Alex Vilenkin has referred to what he does in cosmology as metaphysical cosmology. And I thought, what a remarkable label, metaphysical cosmology, because it's on the very limits of science. And in fact, one other area that I wanted to bring out to piggyback on what Jeff said is the other end of the universe, eschatology, the way the world will end. Eschatology is traditionally a field of theology, right? What will be the last things? Physical eschatology is now a domain of cosmology. Cosmogony is the beginning of the universe. Eschatology, and they use that word, it's the study of how the universe will end. So this would be another example of where questions that were once thought to be metaphysical have now become scientific and are open to investigation. So the lines are blurry. But to answer your question more directly, logical and mathematical truths are not scientifically provable. They're presupposed by, not provable by, science. Ethical truths that you mentioned, aesthetic truths, the beautiful, like the good, is not accessible to the scientific method. Metaphysical truths, like the reality of the external world, the reality of the past, the presence of other minds. These are metaphysical truths that cannot be proven or disproven scientifically. And ironically, science itself. Science is permeated, I think Jeff would agree, with unprovable assumptions, which are reasonable to assume, but they're not provable. For example, in the special theory of relativity, the constancy of the one-way velocity of light is simply an assumption or postulate of the theory. We can measure the constancy of the round-trip velocity of light. If it goes from A to B and back to A, that's always constant. We can measure that. The assumption of the theory is that it doesn't go out at one velocity and come back at another, so that the round-trip velocity is always the same, but in fact it's going one way at different rates. It can't be proved scientifically. That is simply an assumption in the theory. So if you adopt this view that you could only believe what can be scientifically proven, boom, out the window goes special relativity, along with lots of other science.
Well, and I would add on, I mean, I very much, I agree with your statements, and I would say that, the ability to distinguish between science and not science, people have tried to say, okay, this is what science is, and we're going to categorize these kinds of scientists. The reality of it is I understand how I do science when I go into the lab and when I'm working on things, is there is a process I use, and as I adopt that process in my particular discipline, I am generally assured of getting good results, and then I have to go back and test and let other people do the same thing. I find that general principle of, you take that and apply that to Scripture. We have to interpret what the words of the text mean. And there's a process by which people have developed what these words mean. And then they go test it on other Scripture. It's so, if I try and break down what is science, it's very difficult. And it's a process by trying to investigate what is true. And so I use that in other areas rather than just what I'm doing in the lab.
At the foundation of modern science is a value system. You need to test theories fairly and report results honestly.
Yeah.
And interesting, that's clearly not a scientific idea. I mean, people didn't discover that by looking through a microscope or doing a dig or something. But it makes a lot of sense. Look, before we wrap up, let me give these gentlemen an opportunity to tell us about their organizations. I already told you a little bit about Biola University and our apologetics program, but with this crowd, let me tell you about one other degree program that's also done at a distance, and that's a Master of Arts degree in Science and Religion. It's first ranked. It's one of the only degree programs of its kind on the planet, and it's booming and popular and deals with these kinds of questions day in and day out. Would you like to tell us a bit about Reasons to Believe?
Yeah, I work for an organization called Reasons to Believe. It is an organization that is committed to using scientific discoveries and advances as a way to evangelize the scientific community. It's, we build apologetic arguments, but it's apologetics for the sake of evangelism. And what we do is just, we look at the scientific literature and say, what does it have to say about the validity of the Christian faith? And what we find is that it has a lot to say. And so, we regularly write articles, books. We have a stand over there. You can go look at some of the books we have. But we do also offer online classes through Reasons Institute. We offer some through Biola as well. Some of our classes are offered there, but just gives you a chance to explore and interact with people and listen to lectures and ask questions, engage in dialogue, and just be better equipped for the ministry that God has put before you. That's really what we're about. So.
Okay. And Reasonable Faith?
I'm involved in an organization called Reasonable Faith, which is a web-based ministry. Reasonablefaith.org is our website, and you will find there abundant resources, all of them free, that will help you to give an answer for the hope that's in you. Our goal is to provide an intelligent and articulate and yet gracious Christian perspective on issues in the public square. And I would like to just use this opportunity to encourage any of you young folks who are interested in science and are thinking about science as a field of study to pursue that field of study, get a doctorate in that area, and begin to live out your life of Christian discipleship as a professional scientist. The evangelical community has not distinguished itself in the sciences. When you compare us to the Jewish community, there's so many Nobel Prize winners that have come out of the Jewish community, but very few Nobel Prize winners who come out of the evangelical community. And I think that's a scandal and a great shame. We need to help our young people see the value of a calling to professional science as a way of their living out their Christian discipleship. So if you're a college or younger student here today and you're interested in going into science, I would encourage you to see that as a calling from God and to go for it.
Amen.
Very good. I think that, if I'm not mistaken, that about wraps up our time. We didn't get a chance to pass the mic around very far, but I'm sure my colleagues will take a few of your questions during the break. We'll have them go down off the stage first, and here comes Justin to close us off officially.
Give him a round of applause. Yeah. Thank you.